Hey moms, how much I miss you guys in our Wednesday morning therapy sessions. I've been wanting really badly to get to you to finish our book. And I'm going to do each of the last 3 types in separate videos. So I'm hoping to get all 3 done through the course of this week, although, still adjusting to this whole homeschooling and kind of weird situation that we're in. I want to just tell everybody how much I'm blessed by our friendships and just having this group. And I'm hoping that you guys will continue to use our Facebook thread to support each other, because I know all of this isolation and stuff is it's hard. We need our mama groups, we need our friends, we need our supports. So please continue to use that. But I'll dive into this type 5. You all know I like to interact, so it's going to be a little bit weird. But I'm going to preach at you, I guess we could say. I'm going to cover some of the stuff in the study book that you all don't have, as far as the questions that we like to answer that kind of helps you identify if you're a 5, or if, like I said, we keep on talking about both identify if yourself as a 5 or your spouse or your kids, just to kind of help with those, fostering those relationships and help those people with fostering their relationship with God. So, questions to help figure out whether you're a 5. 1, do you tend to keep yourself to yourself, sharing your deepest emotions and thoughts with only very few people? 2, do you tend to need time to process new experiences and emotions? 3, when you're in a group, would you rather observe than participate? 4, if given the choice of staying at home to watch a movie or going to a party with people you don't know yet well, are you inclined to stay at home? 5, do you feel drained after spending too much time in the company of other people? 6, do you prefer to make decisions with your head instead of your heart? And 7, are you wondering why in the world you agreed to come to this discussion group that is all about feelings? Or are you doing this study guide at home alone because the thought of the discussion group makes your hair hurt? I'm hoping that's none of you, but I understand that's part of your makeup if that is the case. The type 5, 6, and 7 are all in the head triad. So you think with your head more than anything else. So those are kind of the questions to ask you if you are a 5. So let's discuss some of the ways that 5s act. So I am going to read one more part, and that's what Dr. Crone says about healthy, average, and unhealthy 5s. So a healthy 5 has a long view of things. They manage an appropriate balance between participation and observation, engaging with others comfortably and demonstrating true neutrality. These 5s are likely to have depth in knowledge in several areas of their lives, and they willingly share their feelings with others. They live in a world of abundance, seeing themselves as part of the whole environment instead of separate from everyone and everything. Average 5s, so your typical 5, they hold to a scarcity mindset, which leads to hoarding time, space, and affection. They feel more at home observing rather than participating in the external world, and thinking substitutes for feeling. 5s in this space tend to rely on themselves rather than faith, and they carefully measure how much time they spend with others. They struggle with anything that makes them feel incompetent or incapable. Unhealthy 5s don't want to depend on anyone for anything. They have a defensive personality that is preoccupied with security, independence, and privacy. These 5s are trapped in believing that there is not enough, and often express that way of thinking with judgment, cynicism, and sarcasm. When they do participate in family or social gathering, they stay separate from others. So they may go, but They find a way to kind of separate themselves, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Some of the famous fives that they talked about is Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates. They talked about what was the Anthony Hopkins? What's that? Anthony Hopkins. People like Jane Goodall, one of my favorite scientists. So fives their deadly sin is avarice, which is greed, which our society tends to associate with money or material things. But that's not really for a five what that means. For a five, greed means that they are, they're hoarding their feelings, they're hoarding their maybe even knowledge, because they're living in a scarcity mindset. They're living in a mindset there is not enough, things to go around. So they feel like if they give up some of their knowledge, that it's going to cost them. Or if they divulge feelings, it's going to cost them. And that there's not going to be enough of themselves left to re-energize. So they prefer to, be observant. They prefer to kind of watch from the outside. They like to accumulate knowledge. A lot of times it can be about just a bunch of little obscure things. They like to just, they hear about a topic, and whereas we might be like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and maybe look something up. Well, they feel like they have to know everything about it, So they'll go really in depth into different types of knowledge or new experiences, which is why they don't like a whole lot of new experiences, because it's too much. But if they're introduced to something new that does spark their interest, then they'll dive, 2 feet in, learning everything they can about it. The thing about fives that I guess in some ways I admire is that they are not attached to emotions. So it's not that they don't have emotions and they don't feel things, but they don't dwell in them. They don't become obsessed by them. They don't react to them. Usually if they have something, maybe hurts their feelings or makes them sad or whatever, then they will detach from, everybody else. It will take them a little bit to process them, but once they've felt that emotion, it's gone. Like they can just let it go. So that can definitely in some ways I, am jealous of. However, they also, when they need to work through their feelings, they need to do it alone. So like I said, if they have get their feelings hurt or they're sad about something or whatever, they tend to want to go separate from everyone else and kind of work through it on their own. They're not going to join some group discussion about venting and really working through emotions and all that kind of stuff. They just prefer to attack it themselves. They're highly independent. So like when you're talking about kids that are fives, they don't like to be dependent at all. I mean, I know to some degree all of our kids want to do everything by themselves and know everything by the time they turn 6. But in general, a person who is a 5 in the personality spectrums really take it as a slight or have an offense if you want to help them or you insist on helping them. They really want to be able to be self-dependent, independent. Even like with school, like they have a lot of mixed emotions about school because they love to learn and gather knowledge and have all of that, but on the flip side of that, they don't necessarily like to share. The social aspect of school is very taxing on them. It's hard for them to find spaces of solitude or spaces of privacy to be able to process things during school hours because there's such a social demand and other kids don't really understand that need. So they struggle kind of in that context of being able to do school. They tend to be more serious kids just because they feel like they struggle to let loose of their silly side. They're so self-contained and headstrong as far as processing things. They struggle with being able to be silly in front of people or silly with people. So they tend to come across as more serious, if they are, are quick-witted and funny and whatever. They just come across as more serious because they have a little bit more of a struggle letting go of that. We talked about letting them, that they need space, and that's true even with kids. To be able to help them to process things, they want to do it by themselves. So while, as a parent, you've got to kind of help them to some degree because that's a learned skill, connecting to emotions and, processing them, they want to feel like they're doing it as much alone as possible. So kind of letting them have space. Speaking of which, in general, they, even as adults, if you're married to a 5, I'm sure you know this, they like to have their own space. Like there's usually somewhere in the house, or, if it's tool shed or whatever, well, not a tool shed, that would be weird, but, if they've got like a work area in the garage or whatever, they tend to want to have some space that is theirs, that they don't really appreciate you being in. And this is with kids too, even, clearly you got to help them, clean up the room or whatever. So it's probably not their whole room, but maybe there's a corner that they really are, more miffed if you come in and clean, or some space, that they feel like is theirs, that they can go to be alone with their thoughts, to process things, to accumulate knowledge, to have that's theirs. And so that's important both, in relationship with your kids and, if you've got a spouse that's a 5, which is, I would imagine, a difficult situation, just because 5s even in relationships struggle with emotions and being able to express those. Even though if you're married to a 5, that they express them in different ways, by letting you in on, things. And because, if you're married to a 5, you are highly valued in their eyes because they don't let that many people in, period. They tend to keep to just a few. That they actually share much information about themselves and definitely any type of emotional response. It's important to allow them that personal space. It's important to allow them time to process things, when the poop hits the fan like it is now, between coronavirus and the tornadoes, whereas you might be falling apart. The great thing about having a 5 relationship is that they are usually keeping it together. Now they may need some more solitude time to process things or whatever, but they're usually a whole lot better in crisis because they don't become so attached to emotions, and because they're able to kind of let things slide and whatnot. So, however, in times of not crisis, is a good time to help them through, connecting to those emotions, helping them, to understand that they can be, at least a little bit vulnerable with you, sharing that piece of them without that they can share a piece of them without losing, what they need, and so that they aren't so guarded. They also, a 5, you've got to get very taxed in public gatherings. So you got to keep that in mind. They're typically the one that might get up and go do the dishes, although 2s do that just to be helpful. But 5s might do that just to have a break, or maybe they tend to, when you take them to a public gathering, a party or something, they may be the ones that kind of excuse themselves, to, go look out the window, or they might kind of go into another room, and or they might excuse themselves to go to the bathroom a little bit more frequently. And really it's just them needing a break from that social interaction, because for them it's very taxing to keep up, because chit chat's is something that they see as frivolous and unnecessary, and So to meet that demand for, the general public, it can be taxing, and they need to take more breaks. And so you kind of need to allow them an avenue for refueling in those times. Or maybe, you just, one of the examples he gave in the book is that often if there was a husband-wife and the wife was a 5, and they would drive 2 separate cars, so that if she needed to leave, early, and he wanted to stay because he was a 7, they could do that. She could go on and go home and be able to refuel and whatever, and he could continue to enjoy the interaction that he needed for his personality. So in work situations, I'm sure you could guess they can be highly prized. They're top inventors, top thinkers. They do value predictability. So if you're working with 5s, or even like your husband or your kids trying to get projects done, or this homeschooling thing, they like to know what's ahead. They like to know the agenda. They like to know what's expected. They like to have projects that you give them a due date, and then they get to run with on their own. That they don't like, spontaneously being interrupted to have to explain a project, or, have a discussion about it or whatever. They just want to be left alone to do the work. They want to know, when it's due, and be able to come back, to you with the final product. So that's usually when they work the best. Or if there are meetings, they want to know when it starts, who's going to be there, what's going to be discussed, when it's going to end, that kind of stuff. In stress, a 5 goes to the unhealthy version of 7. So they'll start to hoard and cling more tightly, which we'll talk about 7 in a little, later this week. But they, for them, they actually become a 5 that's in stress, becomes more frivolous and disorganized and distracted, basically because they're spending so much time in their head trying to process and whatever. So in times of stress, they have difficulty being able to complete tasks because there's so much living in their head, and so much trying to process and categorize everything to make it make sense in their world. When they're feeling very secure, a 5 can almost feel like a totally different person, he said. Often they go to, a positive side of an 8, which is spontaneous and outgoing. And, so it's such a big move that a lot of times they're like, man, what has gotten into, he said, it'll be like, what has gotten into her? All of a sudden she's like, a totally different person. And it's, when they're really secure and healthy, they can go to that side of an 8 and be more outspoken and energetic. So, which is a big contrast to maybe their personality norm. Spiritually, as far as drawing a closeness to God and to the Word, 5s have an advantage in that they are just not. They're so much more detached from earthly things. So they're very attracted to simplicity. And so, with religion, that, it helps to not be distracted by everything that's going on around you, because they just like simplicity, and they like, not having such an attachment and emotions that are connected to worldly things. However, when they're exaggerated in this connection, in this personal, relationship, they can often forget that part of their calling spiritually is to bear fruit. So, that's where it helps to really work with them on, and on living outward, living this spiritual connection outward. So they need to actually practice recognizing and connecting to emotions. They can still, as part of the relationship, they're going to let it go. They don't dwell. It's not teaching them to dwell on things, but helping them learn to connect to their emotions before they let them go, so that they can recognize them and act accordingly. They need to, to help them, you need to help them try to strive to embrace abundant mindset. Understand that there's, enough love to go around, so it's not going to hurt them by sharing love. It's not going to dip into their supply. They're not going to run dry. That sharing their knowledge also fuels knowledge. Things like that. Helping them to embrace that mindset, to try to get away from the unhealthy scarcity mindset, where they think that they have to hoard everything to survive. Including affection, love, knowledge, all of that kind of stuff. They need to practice sharing. They don't like to share information about their lives. He kind of talked about some different friends and how, he didn't know anything. He, realized later that he knew nothing about them. Like, they'd spend hours and hours and hours and hours together. And, because he's a four and wanting to share or whatever, he realized that he knew very little. Like, that they had sisters, or like that, things were going on in their lives. So as a 5, if you're a 5, or as a family member to a 5, you need to help them to practice sharing information about themselves in conversation, and understanding that that's not going to negatively impact them, that information is not going to be used against them. Also helping them to push themselves out of their comfort zone, so can create areas of growth for them. So things like, having them invite somebody just to hang out, like that to them seems frivolous, but sharing them the joy in just being able to go and hang out with somebody. It doesn't have to be because they need to celebrate a birthday, or because they need to, work on a service project or whatever, like just to hang out with people. Things like buying something unnecessary, just something fun for them that's not really necessary, or helping them to feel more comfortable, or jump into a conversation, challenging them to jump into a group conversation instead of becoming a wallflower, or just sitting back and observing the conversation, but actually sharing their views as well. So kind of challenging them to do that, not pushing them necessarily, but in a group setting, maybe say, well, Jenny, what did you think? What did you think about this? I'm interested in your opinion, or whatever. Because it's not that they won't share or won't discuss. It's just that they're less comfortable doing so. But helping them with that can help them become a more healthy 5. So those are some of the things I'd like you to kind of think about, based on all of that. Kind of some of the things that we discussed last time is, if you have a 5 if you are a 5, comment below. Or if you have one in your family, comment below. Remember, this is all just between us. And tell kind of maybe some of the things that you have identified from what we discussed about what a 5 is, and maybe some things that maybe will help you relating to that family member, based on some of the things. If you aren't the 5, but you have a 5 in your life that you have to deal with. I mean, I guess even if it's not a family member, if it's somebody that you have to deal with all the time through work or whatever, what are some of the little nuggets that will help you to relate more to them, better, to relate better with them, or to be able to deal better with them, either in a work or a home situation. So let's try to start a discussion in the thread with that. And just know that I am praying for you guys. I love you guys. And I will be back with type 6, maybe even tomorrow. I don't know. I'm trying to roll with all these curveballs that keep coming at us. But I promise to get through it by the end of this week, because I really want you all to get through this, and then we'll move forward with some other projects we were going to do, or based on this information, some other information we wanted to cover based on this information, and just keep connecting this way. Again, share some prayer concerns. I think Emily has a thread already started for that, but I definitely want you to discuss the 5. So take care of each other, connect with people, don't self-isolate, self-distance, socially distance, but don't socially isolate, okay? Love you guys. Bye.